Dear friends, welcome to the third installment of our series on Russian piano masterpieces. And last time we were doing Rachmaninov, today we're doing Scriabin, who was a classmate of Rachmaninov. But of course he is much less known in the West. He's very well known in Russia, but in the West he's still a niche composer. So today, Peter Donahoe and myself are going to introduce some of you to this possibly new name to you, or maybe tell you something new if you already know about him. And we're going to be concentrating on the piano sonatas. So, as you can see, I'm going to use various pictures here. And most of them will come from Mikhailojus Konstantinos Čiurlionis, a symbolist artist whom Scriabin himself admired. So he went to the exhibition and admired these paintings. So we know that he felt somehow close to this artist. And this is why I included some of them in my presentation. So Scriabin. There is one reason, perhaps, why in the West people are not so familiar with Scriabin, because there is an obstacle between us and Scriabin, and that is his philosophy. So I thought I would do 5 minutes on philosophy, just to get it out of the way, and let's see how I can manage this. So the problem with Scriabin's philosophy, that it's basically a kind of mysticism, and that Scriabin himself believed that his music was related to this mysticism. He didn't have a philosophical system. His library wasn't very big. He wasn't a scholar. He was reading this book and that book, and he was talking to people who was giving him various ideas, and he was absorbing these ideas. He never tried to create a coherent philosophical system, and that's the whole problem. So here I put on the screen, on the slide for you, some of the sources of his philosophy. Very important in this scheme is the Russian symbolist poetry. And some of the Russian symbolist poets he actually knew personally, such as Baltrushaitis, Balmont, and Vyacheslav Ivanov. They were part of his circle. And they believed that the world, the visible world around us, is just a world of symbols, of shadows. And the real world, the realer world than the real world, is the other world. Yeah, so let's start from that. A lot of ideas they borrowed from German philosophers of the 19th century. For example, Schopenhauer, who believed that music was the most important of the arts. Yeah, music was metaphysical. It represented the flow of life. So that's very important, and Wagner is an important mediator here. Without Wagner, Scriabin wouldn't have happened. So, if music is the most important of the arts, Scriabin goes a bit further and says, I am going to write a work, the Mysterium, the ultimate work of art, yeah, which will be a synthetic work of art, not just musical. It's going to have all kinds of things in it, such as ballet, poetry, visual arts, even columns of perfume. And then he makes the next step and says that after this work is performed, nothing else will happen. This will be the end of the world. Yeah, the world will dematerialize. He imagines himself as a kind of god who can bring this dematerialization about. So that also goes very well with symbolists, with the idea that art creates life. Yeah, so whatever you do in your artwork can actually affect the real world. So that's one side of it. Okay, that's great. Now, there's also something else that he borrows from the philosopher Vladimir Solovyov, who already died at that point, but he knew his ideas through somebody else, through Serge Trubetskoy. And the idea that you find in Scriabin very often, that matter is feminine and spirit is masculine, comes from Solovyov. So spirit is Scriabin himself, I'll tell you just a little before we start discussing it. And then there is this really dark part of his philosophy, and it's connected to Helena Blavatsky, the mystic, very kind of odious personality who invented a thing which is called theosophy. She didn't want to call it a religion, but it was a kind of cult. Yeah, so here, apparently she went to Tibet and she was influenced by Buddhism, and she created this very strange thing that Scriabin also liberally borrowed from, yes, such as, for example, his ideas of Satanism and black mass that we're going to discuss today, kind of anti-Christian idea, the idea of Lucifer. It all comes from Blavatsky. Yeah? So this concoction, this cocktail of various ideas, don't expect it to make any sense. I think we have to start from this. Yeah, and you're already gathering the sense that it's very difficult to take it all seriously, perhaps. But we have to think of the times when these ideas came into to fruition. Yeah, and that was the times when people thought that the world was going to end. Well, just like now. So perhaps now we can understand Scriabin a bit better. Yeah, so people really thought they had these apocalyptic presentiments, and Scriabin was just one of them. Yeah, he was not the only one. So from this, I can only show you a picture of an Oriental sage that Scriabin had on top in his study. Yeah, so he was this guy was looking at him askance as he was working, and this is the Oriental sage, presumably that Blavatsky, Madame Blavatsky, met in Tibet, if she ever went there. Yeah, that's not proven. So here we go. Now from this we can go to the piano sonatas, and you can see there are 10 of them. I put them on all this timeline which goes up, because Scriabin's ambition is going up. So my timeline is also going up. And you can see that 5 of them are spread out, and gradually he finds his own style by the 5th sonata. The 5th sonata is very important. And then the last 5, the late ones, are grouped together, clustered around 1912 and 1913, and they're hugely experimental things. Now, you can gather that Scriabin is a kind of composer that can get you obsessed. Yeah, it's the kind of composer that can draw you in. And maybe that's what happened to you, Peter, when you played a few years ago all of these 10 sonatas in one sitting.
Yes, I did do that, yeah. In fact, more than once. I did all the 10 as a cycle in one concert, with a long break in between, like a Wagner opera, which is a coincidence, isn't it? But yes, but if you don't mind me telling my overall story about Scriabin, which was that I've always suffered from not really being able to dislike music. Almost everything that I come across I want to play, and I love, and particularly when I get into it, whilst practicing it and performing it, I always see more in it every day. And Scriabin I chose as the one composer that I would have to make an exception of. In that, in my former life, I used to be a professional orchestral player, and one of the pieces that I played in, only once in fact, was the poem of Ecstasy of Scriabin, which, as you can see from Marina's chart, was written at the same time, almost as the 5th sonata. And because I actually really enjoyed the orgiastic nature of the poem of Ecstasy, and the brilliance of it and the immediate emotional impact of it, I tried to find some solo music by Scriabin that was the same kind of thing. The 5th sonata being the only one I found. The rest of them are not like that at all. And so I learned the 5th. We're talking about mid-1970s here. I learned the 5th, and I played it quite a lot during that year. And then, because I couldn't find anything else, I kind of lost interest in the composer as a whole. It was almost like he was shunning me, or I was shunning him. And then I did my thing in Russia, which was quite a lot, starting in the early 80s. And I was constantly pestered by Russian music lovers to play Scriabin, because he's very popular in Russia and not really in the UK, not even really outside Russia, but particularly, at least at that time. And I gave way. Around about 15 years ago, I gave way and decided I would really explore Scriabin properly. And it got under my skin, as Marian just said. It's very similar to Wagner lovers. You find that you can't stop thinking about it, and it really seriously gets to you and becomes obsessive. And because I was learning all his sonata cycle at once, massive amounts of learning time and practicing of the same composer went on for months and months. And I was told by my wife that every time I came down from my piano room, I'd change my personality. And I needed about 2 hours to get over it. And I suspect that conductors who study Wagner probably feel much the same. And as Marina said, I did indeed play, I think it was in 2012 or so, I did at least 2, maybe 3 complete cycles of all the sonatas in a single concert. And it was absolutely like I'd transformed myself into somebody else by the end of it. And I needed to come down in a way that never really happened with any other composer. Very difficult for me to put Scriabin's music in the same program as any other composer, although I've done it. But it is very difficult to put him side by side with someone else. He is unique, particularly in his later music. And as Marina said, yes, I went through this phase. And I needed, just as an aside, I needed something as an antidote to try and bring me back to the world that I'd known of music before Scriabin. And I chose Mozart. And it is actually the reason that I suddenly got into Mozart in a way that I'd never really done before. And he's dominated everything I've done since. So that's thanks to Scriabin. A very strange pair of bedfellows, really, but that really did happen. And it's the honest truth. So that's my story with Scriabin. I'm sorry, I talk too much, but I'll set the scene.
So it worked on you.
It worked, very much so. And I still love it, very much so. But Mozart was a great antidote.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, let's have a look at various striking features of Scriabin's style. So the first thing that you can see is these really extravagant directions. They're not just tempo directions, but the directions of expression. And he starts with Italian ones, but the ones that nobody else uses, like quasi niente, which means like nothing, so quietly 4p, That's in the first sonata, with fantastical inebriation. That's still, I think that's one of the last Italian ones. And then from the sixth sonata onwards, that cluster of the last 5 sonatas, he switches to French. I think he knew French better, so he could let himself go quite a bit more. Horror surges up, mixed up with the delirious dance, music's panting, and so on. And it goes, it tells you what to do, isn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean, do you follow them? What?
If you can, yes. It reminds me very much of Messiaen. Whose indications are also usually in French, although not always, and very much sometimes difficult to interpret quite what he's getting at. But that's because he doesn't quite know how to put it into words. I think that's the truth. So it becomes ever more extravagant what he's actually trying to say.
Well, Messiaen, of course, was influenced by Scriabin greatly. So. Yes. So.
And they were both. They had both got synesthesia.
Synesthesia, yes. They saw colors, when they heard particular keys. We're going to come back to that in a moment. Okay. Then the next thing, extravagant key signatures.
I'm sorry, Maria. I'm sorry to interrupt, but could I give you a wonderful example from Sonata Number 9 of one of these indications? Because it just strikes me, as we're going to hear Number 9, just strikes me as rather an important one. It's in French, and my French is terrible, but I'll read it out in French and then try and translate it. It says, avec une douceur de plus en plus caressante et empoisonnée. Empoisonnée, I think that's how you say that word. And it means with a sweetness that gets more and more caressing and poisonous, which actually sums up Sonata Number 9. So you'll be looking forward to it now. But it's the most extraordinary thing. What do you actually do whilst you're playing it to conjure that image up? Well, I think I know what to do, but I can't put it into words.
Well, he's already put it into words.
Oh, yes.
So the key signatures, I think it takes that idea from Liszt. Liszt uses quite a lot of sharps. If you write extraordinary music about the other world, about transcendence, you have to have 6 sharps. That's his favorite key, by the way. That's the key which he associated with the color of my background in my presentation. And possibly of my dress, one of these colors, So I wanted to be in F sharp major today.
That applies to Messiaen too, doesn't it? His favourite key was F-sharp major.
Yeah, so, you know, before Scriabin goes into lack of keys, which starts from the Sixth Sonata, so F-sharp major is the absolute kind of ecstatic, transcendent keys. Then there are these polyrhythms, these absolutely crazy things that he writes, which means that one beat, yeah, in one hand you play 5 notes in the time of 9 notes in the other hand. And then it changes into 6 against 9, yeah, but some of them are missing. And it can go even into even more complicated things, yeah, which suggests to me that he wanted it to all be very flowing.
Very much so.
Because I can't imagine himself counting these things.
Well, that's a very big subject as to how much a composer is able to do the things that they're writing themselves. And therefore how much one should emulate their lack of ability to do it. And it's a very deep subject that was brought on by the recording era, of course, because composers before the recording era couldn't leave behind any record of their inability to play their own music. But those who recorded things in the 20th century of their own were limited by their own performing skills, of course. It doesn't mean that one shouldn't do exactly what they wrote. That's always been very central to the way I approach everything. And not to take too much notice of what they actually did.
And Scriabin, of course, you know, he himself admitted to faking quite a lot. And, you know, at one point he says, "I've finally learned the Fourth Sonata. Now I'm going to play it properly." You know, after having performed it in concerts for many years. Yeah, or in the Third Sonata, in the finale, he actually changes the figuration. He makes it different.
Yeah.
So why do you write it like this then? Yeah, so there is a question also, yeah, of what is written and what he himself performed. Then non-tonal harmony, which we're going to talk about a bit later about. And finally, multi-layered textures. Yeah, I've given you this examples of 3 hands. Yeah, I remember my son, when he saw this score for the first time, he said, "What's going on?" He said, "Did he have 3 hands?" You know, so, and each of the hands also playing more than one thing. Yeah, so it's actually 6 things going on together, and that's quite a typical thing for Scriabin, isn't it?
Very much so.
We looked at similar things in Rachmaninov last time, but this is quite a different effect, I think. But that's definitely, you know, something that always happens. And one more thing that I put up there is the note. I hope I got it right. It's the note that doesn't exist on the keyboard.
Yes, it's virtual.
Yeah.
Yes, it's up there somewhere.
So
that's
another example of how he wants to transcend the boundary. So he writes you a note that doesn't exist. So what do you do?
You play the top note and hope that nobody can hear the difference between that and the note above it, which actually most people can't.
Yeah.
I certainly can't.
Well, he himself did the same. You will be happy to hear. So.
Right.
Another thing that I wanted to mention is that whenever you listen to Scriabin, there is one very good guide to follow. That there are 3 main types of expression, especially in middle period and late Scriabin. Yes, so one thing is, he himself names it will. Yeah, the will, that's the masculine force. If you take Poem of Ecstasy, for example, it's a solo trumpet that goes up and up like a fanfare. Yeah, so many of the sonatas have that type. Then in contrast to that, it's eros. Yeah, so it's soft lyrical caressing, yeah, and the time stops and you have this feminine theme. And the third one, which is kind of ecstatic flight or divine play, as he himself described it, and that would be quick passages and trills and leaps, yeah, and it's more like a dance. And usually these things map on very well onto the sonata form, yeah, because the usual sonata has these kind of 3 different groups in the exposition, which are contrasting, a masculine with feminine, and then possibly something a bit playful at the end. Yeah, so his forms are quite conventional because he can fill them with his own content, which is absolutely inimitable. So I just thought we would go through the sonatas in chronological order because it's not possible to do it in any other way to really appreciate the trajectory of how he was developing. So the first sonata is associated with a very tragic moment in his life when at the age of 20 he did something to his right hand. And his career of performing pianist was over. He couldn't compete with Rachmaninov, for example, anymore. That meant that he had to rethink his options, and these are bits from his diary. He was praying, and he composed the first sonata with the funeral march at the end, which is an extremely kind of affecting piece, isn't it?
And you can hear very much echoes of Chopin's funeral march sonata in there.
Yeah, Chopin, of course, is great idol.
Yeah.
It's known, I think he slept with a score of Chopin under his pillow or something like that. So Chopin is his starting point. This idea that he considered himself a disabled pianist, really, that his right hand never worked properly. Can you hear this, or can you see it in the score? Is it?
I can see what he wanted to be able to do. I wouldn't say that his disability limited his writing, but it's certainly very obvious that he wouldn't be able to do what he'd written because of his injury. And it was an injury he never recovered from in the way that Schumann did. Although that hugely influenced his output too. But Schumann's finger recovered from the injury, whereas I think Scriabin was always disabled because of, I'm not even sure what the accident was, but whatever it was, it was very serious to his right hand, yes.
But is that why the left hand is playing so much?
Could be. Well, you could say the same of Rachmaninov, though, and he didn't have any injuries. So I don't know, right? It's very easy to read things into it that maybe, making it fit the pattern that you wanted to. But it seems very obvious that he wanted to have a very large hand, which may well have been something to do with being a colleague of Rachmaninov, who did have one. And the music is sometimes really awkward because of the size of the hand that he seems to want you to have. Plus the fact, and this very much reminds me of Ravel. The harmonies also do, by the way. But the way Ravel writes with the two thumbs crossed like that so much. Anyone who's played the Sonatine by Ravel will know that the first three lines you spend the whole time like this with your thumbs constantly crossing over as if you're knitting. And Scriabin is very much like that. In a lot of his music, regardless of which period it's from, it's always there, this kind of overlapping of the hands, which of course, depending on your individual hands, can produce all sorts of problems for one person that are not there for someone else, and vice versa. And quite a few of them are there for me. But that applies to all pianists, really.
Sonata number 2. So this is the one that you're going to demonstrate in a moment.
If I could just say that the first movement, which is it's in two movements, of course, but the first movement is the one I'll play, strikes me as being perhaps, at one point I used to say it was the most beautiful piano piece I'd ever played, which is probably a silly thing to say, but it is phenomenally sensuous and beautiful and colourful and lyrical. Well, I'll just play it, shall I? But really, one of the most exquisite things ever written. And for the same composer to have written that and the 9th sonata, which is a nightmare to listen to, again, please don't be put off. It's just extraordinary to me that he could change so much. Anyway, sonata number 2, first movement.
Now, just hold on. I need to find it.
It's quite a heavenly piece, isn't it?
Absolutely beautiful.
It's interesting that he starts in G sharp minor and finishes in E major. And, you know, much later than Scriabin wrote that. So, composers were considering that they should stay in the same key most of the time, but he didn't worry about that.
No.
He went back into G sharp minor for the second movement, of course, but we haven't got time to hear that, unfortunately.
Yes, and he said himself that it was about the sea, yeah, that it was a landscape. And so that was all still before all these crazy ideas, yeah, when he was still kind of with nature. Now the third one, here where things kind of started getting interesting. And this is a painting which the critics, by the way, associated with that sonata. It's a painting by Wrubel, and it's The Demon. Yeah, so the sonata was heard as being some demonic, yeah, kind of almost melodramatically, dramatic to the point of being melodramatic. So, and people are saying here, well, one of the critics is saying that it's extraordinarily difficult, yeah, that the difficulties are sometimes inconsistent with the spirit of the instrument. I don't know whether you would agree with that.
Not as much as number 4, but yes, it is basically true.
And disproportionate for the effect they produce. Yeah, that it's too hard for the effect that you get from it.
I'm not going to criticise.
Yes.
I think it's a wonderful piece. I just wish we had time to hear some of it. But it's that also has one of the most beautiful melodies I think anyone's ever written in the third movement of that. But it has this terribly tragic ending that's actually immediately after what appears to be a triumph. And it suddenly goes wrong for the last few lines. It's a really terrible moment, in fact. One feels very sad to have to actually do it in public. It's just so terrible for the audience because it's so incredibly ecstatic for a while and then suddenly so down, which number 2 doesn't do.
Yes, I think that's why they're associated with the demon,
Yeah,
you know, with the fallen angel.
So. Yeah.
And also, you know, apart from being a very romantic piece still, people started associating it with decadence. Decadence was the word of the day at the time. It was not necessarily negative. You know, people were delighted to display their decadence as well. But this is a very nice phrase that I'd like to quote by one critic, that this is an art that has cut itself off from the simple and healthy moods of the masses. One would think it was written during the Soviet time, yeah, but it wasn't. It was 1902. From the broad, fragrant expanses of the fields, meadows, and forests. You just had something much more healthy in the second sonata. Yeah, and here, the city, the four walls, refined and complicated dispositions of the top 10,000, yeah, of the elite. This is the sphere to which such art belongs. So this is, you know, people have started to sense that something is going on. Now, I just wanted to show this because there is actually a quote from Scriabin himself about how he wanted it played. Yeah, he wanted it to be played by one hand, although I guess some pianist might be tempted to play it.
It depends on the size of your hand, doesn't it? Simple as that.
Well, he thought that basically that this sonata, first of all, shouldn't be played by women. Although I must say that women have played a great role in popularizing Scriabin's music, especially in the first few years. And his first wife, Vera Isakovich, who was a wonderful pianist, she continued to play his music even after he abandoned her with 4 children. Yeah, so he wasn't very happy about that, by the way. But a lot of people actually liked her playing more than his own. And a lot of, and also there were these students that he had who also played Scriabin. Yeah, so you have to remember that it's not just masculine music. Yeah, it was done by women right at the very start.
Well, there's nothing more likely to make women want to play it than the composer saying it's for men, is there? Particularly if they're Russians.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
Yes. It's a challenge, isn't it?
Well, yeah, absolutely. It's throwing down the gauntlet.
Yeah.
Perhaps it was deliberate. Who knows?
So I just wanted you to hear a little bit of Scriabin himself playing a bit of the third sonata. And this is very imperfect It's not as good as Rachmaninov's piano rolls. The technology for him wasn't so good. So there are lots of things that didn't get recorded. They're like his pedal, for example. Everyone was saying, look at his feet. You know, he was doing these magical things with the pedal. That is not recorded, and we're also quite not ever sure, you know, what tempo it should go at. And the touch, of course, a lot of things are lost in this roll. But what is so striking and weird about it, what he does with the tempo, what he does with kind of how he plays it in this improvisatory way, and basically it has almost no relation to what is written, isn't it?
And yet writes in a very detailed way.
Yeah. Yeah, he writes exactly. He's extremely precise about how he notates things, and then he plays them in a completely different way. So let's just hear a little bit of that.
Well, if somebody played that to me in the masterclass, I would say, well, why don't you do what the composer wrote? Why don't you play the rhythms that he wrote? Why don't you stick to the tempo he wrote? And so on. It's very often the case. It's the same with Prokofiev. It's not really so much the same with Rachmaninoff because he was such a great performer. But the fact that you're a great composer doesn't mean you're going to be not going to be suffering from the same pressures as any other performer, particularly if it's your own music, of course. I think we forget that very easily.
Well, interestingly, Rachmaninoff took an issue with this style of performance that people were imitating Scriabin also, and obviously, and he was encouraging that. But Rachmaninoff took an issue with that and said, well, for me, Scriabin is a musician, and I'm trying to play the music that he wrote. I'm paraphrasing right now. It's correct in the transcript. You can read it. Yeah, but and he says at the moment everyone has developed this esoteric manner of playing Scriabin, which is quite abstruse, and basically, well, you cannot hear what is going on. No. So many people also complain that you couldn't actually make sense of the music when it's played in this way. Even when Scriabin himself played it. And of course, to him, it made a lot of sense. Yeah, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's just as...
I think that's composer's disease. You know, I think perhaps even starting with Beethoven's metronome marks, which don't make sense at all, you know. But then, of course, he was deaf, which has probably got a lot more to do with it, seriously, than anything else. But all composers tend to play their own music with a very different approach and attitude to when they themselves play someone else's music. It's a very different thing, and I think it's very dangerous if you're going to emulate what the composer does. Just stick to the score. It's always been my philosophy.
Sonata number 4. So another borderline piece, which some of the conservatives still enjoy. Glazunov says it's original, full of intoxicating beauty, its ideas as expressed with great clarity and concision. But here, Scriabin already finds some of his very famous images, like this flight to the sun. This is how he described the finale. Flight at the speed of light, straight towards the sun, into the sun. Yeah, so this it's already beginning. And that's right at the point, 1903, when he starts getting into these philosophies and starting to think about his Mysterium. Yeah, so this is the beginning of the new Scriabin. There's a funny anecdote about him living in Switzerland, and talking to fishermen, preaching to fishermen on the lakes, on the Lake of Geneva, and telling them about socialism. Yeah, so he was a socialist at that point. So at that point, that was his ideal that he was kind of wanted to fly towards.
Could I just mention that number 4 in particular, but there are many examples in the piano concerto and in the études as well as the other sonatas, of what appear to me to be the forerunners of jazz. And I mean seriously that I don't know whether the jazz composers of the early 20th century knew of Scriabin. I'm sure some of them did, but there's certainly no question that the jazz harmonies that he used in his middle period in particular are very, very similar to what you'd hear from American jazz in particular. And in the second movement of the fourth, also the rhythms. I mean, it almost sounds like I'm being frivolous, but I'm not. It sounds like Oscar Peterson. It's quite extraordinary. And you know, several decades before that style appears to have become very popular. Just amazing. It's kind of influenced without them even knowing that it was there. It's one of the most fascinating sides of Scriabin that I can think of, because there's a lot of jazz again in Messiaen, a lot of jazz chords that seem to have stemmed from the same source. Of course, yes, Ravel. All the French composers really, but certainly Ravel more than any, I suppose, yeah. And the French influence on Russia and the Russian influence on France was huge in both directions around that time, in all arts, I think, yeah.
Peter, I was wondering if you could play that little étude, because it comes from the same year as the fourth sonata, and it has this interesting thing about it, that it starts with very strange harmonies, but then it resolves them into something which is quite nice. It's almost like salon music.
Yes, yeah? Yes, it's a very intriguing piece, because I think it's the closest that I can think of to Scriabin having a sense of humour, which isn't very close.
Not much of that, yes.
But there is something remarkably, appealing about it in a sort of slightly jokey way. But at the same time, although it, of course, predates it, it reminds me very much of that strange music that in the 1950s, a lot of horror movies from Hollywood used to have, that was usually played on an instrument called a theremin, which anticipated the onde martineau, which, of course, again is a Messiaen, very much a part of Messiaen style. And, well, I've talked for longer than the piece lasts, actually, so I'll just play it.
It's really lovely.
Yes, it is. Absolutely, it's absolutely unique as well. In his even within his own pieces, never mind anyone else's.
Yeah, and of course beyond the sonatas, there are lots of pieces like that. Yeah, a lot of pieces which are very, very short.
Very short.
So
yeah.
that's the majority of them. Yeah, but today we're just concentrating on the sonatas. So let's go really quickly through the fifth sonata, which is amazing because you can see it starts. Well, it's again 6 sharps, and it starts. I don't know whether you could just illustrate.
And there is then a very long silence, followed by incredibly beautiful music that develops into something utterly wild and ecstatic. Extraordinary piece. This is the one that I mentioned before that I learned and played a lot in the 70s.
Yeah,
And,
so it's connected to the
can't find
poem of
anything else.
ecstasy, as you already said, and it shares the literary text with it. Yeah, it has as an epigraph part of the poem that he wrote himself as a program for the poem of ecstasy. I very much recommend that you follow the link in the transcript and read the whole thing, because it's the craziest thing imaginable. If I put some of the lines here, basically he is imagining himself at this point already this kind of divine spirit, creative spirit, and he's making love to the universe. In the most graphic terms, he describes how he would make love tenderly, and he would make love sadistically, and it's absolutely sort of incredible erotic poem. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that then, you know, he found his muse, Tatiana Schlözer, who was absolutely adoring him as a genius, was telling him that he was a genius every single moment of the day, and he believed her. And this is, I think, the root, the cause of all this craziness that comes later, because this is what he said, for example, about his poem. Yeah, I have just committed to paper a monologue of fantastic beauty. Yeah, so he thinks that he is an amazing poet as well. Now read that, and you might disagree. The fifth sonata also has this very famous ending, which is probably even more striking than the beginning, yeah, because it doesn't end in any key at all. And as you can see from this rather amusing reminiscence, you know, half of the public didn't understand what happened, why he suddenly ran off the stage, because it just wasn't. I don't know whether you could just do that.
Yes, I can do that.
Yeah?
It's a shame that there is a pause bar at the end, because what I used to do, which was ignore that pause bar and actually be halfway off the stage before the piano would start resonating. Yes, sir. And you do that, and people would go, "Oh, it's over." You know, oh, there's something wrong. But actually there wasn't. It's very difficult to make sense of that ending, particularly as it's so difficult, technically, apart from anything else. And it stems from a gigantic kind of ecstatic climax that is tonal, in fact. And then it goes off into this. It's extraordinary.
Kind of into cosmos, you know, flies out.
It's worth mentioning just at this point, though. As you can see, it's fortissimo at the end, and there are moments in all his early music where you see fortissimo and fortissimo, and very extreme loud dynamics occasionally. After number 6, as far as I know, he never used anything more than forte. And certainly in number 9, there is nothing that's more than forte. In other words, he wanted the piano range to be much more concerned with the lower dynamics, as did Chopin, and so did Debussy. It's a very interesting aspect of his piano style, because it means, by definition, that you're exploring much more colours, because it's not extremely loud. And it's very tempting at the end of the horrific number 9 to be very loud. In fact, I'll probably not be able to resist the temptation, but only for that moment, that climax, which is the climax of what appears to have been an impression of a nightmare. Everything else is very, very subdued, and actually much more menacing for it.
So at this point, at the point of the fifth sonata, we get already these people like Rimsky-Korsakov wondering whether Scriabin has gone mad. And he thinks it's a wonderful music, yeah, but he laid out a plan of his next work, which is something grandiose and even unrealizable. Generally, he is now into philosophy, upon which he builds his works, and as he suffers from megalomania, he has walked into such dense forests that some consider him simply mad. Yeah. Could it be that he's going mad from some kind of religious erotic fixation? Yeah, possibly. So there is now a separation between the cult of people around Scriabin who absolutely adore him and people who just completely reject him. That all starts at the fifth sonata. And of course, then he makes the next step towards his Mysterium, and that's Prometheus. That's the piece that has all kinds of things, the organ, the piano, and also the light show. And this is where his synesthesia comes in. Yeah? I will just show you very, very briefly a little bit of a realization of a light show, Prometheus with a light show, that Scriabin wasn't able to see because there was no technology to produce that at the time. Wanted you to see how it goes from blue to red, yes?
At that time they would have used limelight, yes? As in the definition of limelight, which is literally something that you used lime for to produce the lighting in theatre.
Well, he had this little contraption with little electric light bulbs, which are just pathetic, really. They wouldn't have done anything like that.
So they didn't really have electricity.
No.
It had started.
It was just the very beginning, yes. So the Mysterium, just to recap, yeah, so he's still thinking about this. He is now thinking that he might do a preparatory act first. He's thinking of writing a Mysterium in a synthetic language, not even in Russian at first, and then he goes on to produce some Russian version for it. He wants to buy a place in India. He wants to actually buy a piece of land to build this temple and to bring the world to its end. It really starts kind of taking shape in his mind. And the seventh sonata, which comes after the fifth, I haven't made a mistake, yeah, the seventh is a kind of pre-Mysterium piece. So if you want to kind of think of what he wanted to achieve harmonically, this is what starts to happen. So the big climax, the end of the world, yeah, is the famous what is it, 25-note chord?
Yeah. That's that chord.
Yeah. And after that, it suddenly dissipates. Yeah.
And of course, that's very jazzy, actually. If you take it away from its context, it's a jazz chord. Yeah, absolutely.
Even the symbolist poet Andrei Belый started mocking him a little bit. Yeah, so saying, describing him in this amusing way, how when he said his little finger touched the can't mode, the middle finger latched onto the theme of culture, and then suddenly, allez hop, the index finger leapt over several keys to land on the Blavatsky note. Yeah, so even the symbolists already, it's getting a bit too much for them. Sonata number 6 is very different, it's very dark. Yeah, so I don't know whether you could just play the very first chord. It's frightening. Yes. And Scriabin was talking about the dark forces here. He was even scared of this sonata himself and never actually played it. I wanted to show here that the notes in the chord and the notes of the melody are the same now. Yeah, there is no now distinction between melody and harmony. And when you see at what the notes are, they are the notes almost, but one of the octatonic scale. And this is why it sounds like jazz, because the octatonic scale is one of the most famous modes in jazz. Yeah, so it's this kind of scale which sounds always as if it's something supernatural, at least.
It does rather indicate that he thought that the sonata wrote itself, that he was frightened of it himself and wouldn't play it, as if it was a separate entity to him, which is very difficult to understand.
I know. Sonata 9, I don't know, shall we talk about it now?
Do you want to miss number 8 out?
Well, the next one is number 9 after 6, actually. That's how it was written. Yes, so this is the dark one, and this one goes against the Mysterium idea, and he felt that he was actually going against his own philosophy, but rather following his artistic principle. Yeah, so this is something extremely dark, and this is how he described it to Nadezhda Rimsky-Korsakov, that the beginning is dark forces, in the middle there is a nightmare, and in the end, dark forces again. And he uses the phrase defiling of the sacred. Yeah, so something blasphemous about that piece. But on the contrary, in contrast to the sixth, he actually loved it and loved playing it. And lots of people loved it, Busoni and Prokofiev, and I've chosen it because I think it's one of the most palatable of the late sonatas. So you're going to hear it just in a 2 minutes time. And in the meantime, I'm just going to finish this whistle-stop tour. So number 8 is again something like a sketch for the Mysterium, so another version of number 7. And number 10 suddenly goes back to nature. Yeah, we had nature in number 2. And he talks about it being earthbound. It talks about insects, butterflies, moths. These are all flowers that have come to life. They are the subtlest of caresses, barely touching. They were all born of the sun, and the sun nourishes them. A whole sonata of insects. And you think, oh, well, this is something different. Yeah, it has this kind of nature call there. But don't be deceived by that. Yeah, because then he says, on that last day, in that last dance, so he's thinking about Mysterium again, I will shatter into 1,000,000 moths, and so will everyone else. Perhaps at the end of the Mysterium, we will no longer be people, but will become caresses, animals, birds, moths. I just wanted to mention that Churlenis also produced a painting where moths are flying towards the flame. And I just think it's so interesting that they had shared the same image. In the last sonata that never became a sonata, which is called Vers la flamme, towards the flame, it's almost like Scriabin himself is flying into this burning sunlight. And as you probably know, he died very suddenly. He died of sepsis, of blood poisoning. And one can only imagine what could have happened after. Would have he just got pressured into producing something, or perhaps disappointing his followers and not being able to produce the Mysterium?
Or perhaps doing something like Sibelius did, which is to stop writing music altogether and live for another 30 years, which is an extraordinary thing to do, but he did. A lot of people felt that way around that time. It's almost like everything had come to the end, the end of the development of style, the development of philosophies, and so on. Even Stravinsky said that a little bit later. Perhaps that would have happened to Scriabin. But then he cut himself shaving and got sepsis. Yes,
and Scriabin actually said at one point, he said, after all this, there will be just a black line on a white sheet of paper. So it's almost like he predicts abstractions. And then you think maybe he's not talking about the end of the world. Maybe he's talking, again, just in artistic terms, and it's all a metaphor. But we don't know. So let us go on now and hear the 9th sonata, the scary piece. Just give me a moment.
Yes. It is worth mentioning, by the way, that contrary to so many other composers, contemporary composers, particularly in the 19th century, but also the 20th, all the Scriabin sonatas are essentially very short, the longest by far being the first one, which is in 4 movements. But the second one's in 2, and third and fourth are also in 2. And after that, they're in single movements, the 9th being the shortest of all. It's something like 7 minutes for the whole piece. And that was very, very much a Scriabin, an essential part of his style, I think, for everything to be gradually becoming miniaturized. And so many, as we mentioned before, I think so many of his shorter pieces are so short, as with the étude that I played, that it's almost like he was a miniaturist. But then he wrote an orchestral work like Prometheus, or the Poem of Ecstasy, or any of his 3 symphonies, absolutely gigantic in scope. And one of the questions I would like to ask Marina, how he managed to be such a great orchestrator when so little of his music was for anything other than the piano, which is the same as Chopin, but he was not a great orchestrator. There's something in his imagination, perhaps influenced by Rachmaninov and other Russian composers, that made him so imaginative with the orchestra. Anyway, Just a few idle thoughts. I don't really know the answer. Sonata number 9, the Black Mass.